day of the conference, Inaugural Corporate Governance Conference 2018. And the second half of today's conference, I hope you had very nice and splendid lunch. And the next speaker we have is Dr. Christine Chow, Director of Hermes Equity Ownership Service. And she will be discussing the topic on driving strategy for long-term success while facing short-term needs. Please give her a big hand.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have one of the most challenging tasks today because I will have to try to keep you all awake after lunch. So, to start it differently, may I ask you to stand up and help with doing a bit of exercise after lunch? Just to feel, yeah? Okay, we have a leader here. Okay, we're not doing mahjong, huh? Okay. Head stretch. Okay, now, handstand. Anyone? No. Right, so thank you for joining me, yes. I hope you had a good lunch. Driving strategy for long-term success while facing short-term needs. It's a very, very broad topic. And when I was thinking what would be the best way for me to share with you our view on this issue, it's probably to walk you through a little bit about our corporate purpose, where it comes from, and to link the themes to what we do on a daily basis when we talk to companies, the issues we discuss, whether it's short-term related or long-term. So maybe I'll start with that. Ta-da. Thank you. It's a magic hand. It's the invisible hand at the back. Maybe one more. So who we are. The name Hermes has caused some interest earlier. And to say that we're not related to a particular fashion brand, I must say that we are kind of related to a Greek god. Hermes is, according to Greek legends, he's the messenger of God. And why will we choose this name? It is because that we, as a fund management company, we started as an internal fund manager for one of the biggest pension fund in the UK, the British Telecom Pension Scheme, BTPS. And in the old days, when the British Post Office was still part of the whole pension plan, this is where we get the message from, the messenger of God. And when we say we care about long-term as a fund manager, it is linked back to who we started out as serving, because we started out as a manager for a pension fund. Our primary interest and goal is to help pensioners retire better. In fact, in one of the articles I've written for the SIAS event, which appeared in the Business Times in Singapore, we stated our corporate goal as well. Our corporate purpose is to deliver holistic returns. And what does that mean? It is to deliver outcomes for our clients that goes beyond financial, and to consider it the impact of our discussions on society and environment and the wider world. It sounds like a very grand purpose, but we keep that in mind, that at the end of the day, when people such as fund managers introduce themselves, and we are fund manager, we keep it very clear that we are capital allocator, in the sense that we are helping pensioners, individuals, because ultimately the money comes from individuals, like Mr. David Gerald said. It's the mums and pops, it's each and every one of you here with your pension, with your savings. So institutional investors themselves should always bear in mind, like ourselves, that we are working for someone else. So where did our journey begin in corporate governance? What you can see here, it looks as if it started in 2004, but I can tell you that it goes way back. Some of you might remember that back in the early 90s, there was a Cadbury review of corporate governance in the UK. And what prompted that? Robert Maxwell was a media tycoon. And in November 1991, when he was on holiday in Greece, he passed away suddenly. And what followed was that it transpired that he has been taking the pension money from the company's pension fund to push up the share price. 50% of the board members have signed papers that allowed him to do that. 50% of board members had no idea what happened. So when they called an urgent board meeting, they thought someone wanted to buy the company, so they all got quite excited. So what followed was that at the time, our CIO, Alistair Gooby, was one of the first UK managers to advocate it is important to have board dialogue on corporate culture and governance. So we actually started talking about governance and working on it since the 90s. But we didn't form a specific team until 2004, because over time, more and more other pension funds came to us and say that we need a stewardship platform. But not everybody has the resources. So it becomes, my team, the Hermes EOS, which is Equity Ownership Services, becomes a team within Hermes Investment Management to serve not just the BT Pension Fund, but also other asset owners to help them with stewardship and communication and engagement with companies. So we're very proud that in 2006, the PRI, some of you might have come across, Principles for Responsible Investment, was actually signed in our office. I think the government pension fund in Thailand is also an early supporter of this initiative as well. So fast forward to what we're doing now. We started out as a one-person team back in the days, with one person engaging, writing letters to UK companies. Now we have over 20 people covering global markets. So this is just showing you that our stewardship assets has been growing especially fast the last 5 years as investors are aware of their stewardship duties. And engagement sits at the core of what we do. When we say engagement, we engage with companies. We also engage with regulators, stock exchanges, and also NGOs and OECD, IFC, because we find that in the traditional sense of investment research, the scope tends to be quite limited. If you talk to a traditional analyst, they would read broker reports and they would try to meet with CFO and talk about, what is your earnings guidance next quarter? And we found that this is an incomplete approach. So when we engage, which is at the core of what we do, we engage and talk to a range of stakeholders, which goes back to what Mr. Low was talking about. That stakeholder communication is not just for companies, but also for us as well. So when we engage, we look at a number of different themes. I have chosen just 4 themes that to share with you today, but it might touch on others as well. In terms of globalization, I guess I don't need to explain too much of the kind of dilemmas that we are facing now. The Economist magazine last week has, I don't know if you've seen the current issue. It talks about it in September 1843, James Wilson, the Economist, championed free trade, and now we're facing a dilemma of what's happening in the world. And when we talk to companies, we often talk about the impact of the trade situation at the moment, not just between China and the US, but also the impact on other trade issues. On demographics, that has a huge impact on how companies behave because of the way the consumer expectations are different. And I'll probably touch on the global supply chain or the debtors-creditors issue that was raised earlier in the panel as well. And climate change. We have long discussed that climate change seems to be a long-term issue, but I think this week and last week we have seen the Typhoon Mangkhut, and also in the US there is the Hurricane Florence. some of the issues are not so long-term anymore, and some of the insurance and also other damages to companies' operations could well be more imminent than we think. And technology will, well, I guess we can talk about it for almost another day. So I'll just start with how we look at long-term and short-term. We see long-term and short-term, when we refer to these phrases, they tend to be a dichotomy, but it is not true. Everything is linked. So what we see right now, say in the annual report, it's a function of what could become in the future as well. But there are issues that we look at in the short term, which we look at a lot of disclosure. For example, we would consider accounting practices of companies. Increasingly, we are providing more and more training to our ESG analysts on forensic accounting, which we think is certainly an important area to push for more competence and understanding. Because there is aggressive accounting, but there is also, beyond that, it's not a clear cut. It's something that we do right now, kind of short-term areas that we look at. We look at value creation. How do we measure that? Of course, there is an outcomes-based way of looking at value creation, but we also look at the more formulaic way, such as the return on invested capital over weighted average cost, ROIC WACC, weighted average cost of capital, which we do look at. And when we look at ESG, we often advocate that G sits right at the top. So I think the acronym itself could be misleading for some. Governance is the core of the way the company functions, its culture, and its future. So we'd prefer to call it GES. And as we move towards medium term to long term, we will look at and engage with companies on their M&A strategy. Is there a good decision-making process when they consider mergers and acquisition? And their existing capital structure, because we talked to both the fixed income team as well as equity. And recently we've just published an article looking at when we engage with companies, the equity interest and the fixed income investor interest is not always contradict each other, which is worth taking a look. And at the same time, we ask companies to disclose their dividend policy, the short-term, medium-term, and long-term targets, how they plan to create that policy. More and more companies are looking at free cash flow. So these are the sort of more short-term to medium-term issues we look at. But in the longer term, this is what we are most interested in. So if I may, I would like to quote the late King Bhumibol, the Great. He said that we cannot be alone and still be happy if others around us are suffering. Instead, we should share their suffering and help ease their troubles according to our ability and capability. So this is where we link when we see short-term capital markets, metrics, KPI reporting, linking to what's happening around the global economy, to global society. And that's where the stakeholder perspective come in as well. And beyond that, the planet, and hence the climate change is one of the issues that we discuss. And in that understanding of that process, we understand that we need to collaborate with stakeholders as much as possible. There will be conflicts of interest, and it is a matter of engaging and talking through the differences that we have. And global partnership. We collaborate with other institutional investors on certain issues, which I'll come on to a little bit later on some of the initiatives that we have to share with you what investors think are important as long-term issues. And at the end of the day, we're also looking at how what we do in collaboration and individually as a company can lead to a more prosperous society, technology-enabled. Globalisation is a paradox of progress, as we see here. There was a period of time when the merits of globalisation were celebrated, But now increasingly, more and more people seems to have the doubt. And as a result of globalization, there are a few issues that we address from the engagement perspective. First thing is, if you look at the top left, GDPR, some of you might be familiar with that, is the EU regulation on data privacy. And we have been engaging with companies on how they comply with that. Because for companies that do not comply, these are companies that are not just EU-based, but the regulation stated that within 40 days, if an EU subject writes to the company to ask for their personal data to be disclosed on how they have been handled, the company needs to respond. And if not, they will be fined a certain percentage of the revenue. And that's a huge impact because, for example, Google came out and said that this is imposing EU regulations globally. But at the same time, we are seeing more and more data privacy regulations coming out. And if I understand correctly, yesterday there was an announcement of a number of Chinese companies announcing their data privacy principles. I was told by my colleague. So there are more and more initiatives on data privacy and what it means. But at the same time, the education of users, such as ourselves, are also improving. You might have seen news about Google devices. So if you disable your location on your smartphone, it could potentially still be tracking your whereabouts. And if you go incognito online, you could still be tracked because you will have your footprint. So these are the things that we're beginning to understand. How do we leave our personal footprint, and what would be the company's responsibility? What should be their responsibility? It's a greenfield, nobody knows. So in our engagement, we try to understand what is the company's stance, what is their way of anticipating what might be the regulations to come. So these are some of the discussions that we would like to see companies internally at the board level are also discussing as well. Because this is not just about compliance. It is about how do you safeguard your customers' information, what might be the regulation that is coming, and if it does happen, how are you going to handle it? It is a board priority. So secondly, geopolitics. So I'll give a US and China as an example. Now, in many of our engagements, we talk about the medium to long-term plan for building manufacturing sites. Should it be in China? Should it be in the US? Should it be in Vietnam? Should it be in Thailand? I think as yesterday Jack Ma was saying at his Invest Today that he's not expecting the trade tension to ease even after Trump, as provocative a speaker as he is, and that there might be a long-term impact on how the global supply chain will reorganize as a result of that. So these are some of the things that we're talking about. International trade and money flows. So more and more we encourage companies to join a platform to fight financial crime. So bribery and corruption is one of those issues that we discuss with companies a lot. How do you monitor bribery and corruption, potential bribery and corruption issues, or anti-money laundering? But we find that a lot of Asian financial institutions or Asia-based financial institutions tend to work generally within the region or within the country. So we encourage them to reach out to regional or more global financial crime platform and participate in industry collaboration to address these issues. So you might see the three icons there on the right, you might be guessing what that was. The one on the right with a calculator is tax. Tax is one of the most difficult issues we find talking to companies about, the tax liabilities. Because of different structures, I think some of the more high-profile technology companies have been subject to tax issues. But these are some of the very, very difficult issues that I find very difficult because companies are, of course, not inclined to talk about tax liability and with investor, and they will usually refer it to legal counsel. But it does exist. The one on the top with the tick is cyber security. Cyber security, again, is one of the emerging issues that are relevant to all companies, whether, as we have discussed earlier this morning, even the health records of in Singapore has been hacked, and it is very difficult to establish a best practice standard, except that we ask companies to go beyond what they are doing at present. Many companies still have a quarterly report on cybersecurity and presentation to the board, and we find that that forms the basis of what needs to be done. Cybersecurity needs to step up in terms of the ability of board level to understand and provide oversight. And the last one is global supply chain, which relates to one of the questions that was raised at the panel earlier today about the debtors and creditors days and how larger companies squeeze smaller companies. As part of our engagement, we talk to companies about the responsible supply chain and how they, in some cases, in order to ensure a continuous and best practice standards along the supply chain, how they can help suppliers to meet the needs. For example, Samsung Electronics, this is also in their annual report, in the ESG report, they provide supplier finance where appropriate, but not all companies can do that. Apple, for example, they have just earlier this year established a renewable energy fund for the supplier in China to help access renewable energy where they are not able to do so. So there are different ways where we encourage companies to help supplier. This looks too small, but it is a slide on climate change. You can see from the 1980s, the yellow dot is where there was a drought heat wave that hits us globally. And that was the extreme event that took place that year in July and August. As we can see, we fast forwarded to 2017. The number of hurricanes, which is the blue dot, it's not really a dot anymore, it's a semicircle. So I think the slides will be made available after this presentation online, so you can take a good look at it. The key message is that climate-related events, whether it is man-made or not, it is increasing in cost and frequency and unpredictability. It will just come. And what we have talked to companies and insurance companies for years is how they can integrate climate change impact in their insurance products and their pricing. And interestingly, Chinese insurance companies seem to have the best data that we've seen, or some of the best data that we've seen in addressing that. I remember attending a green finance conference. At least 2 insurance companies in China are now establishing their own sensors at factories of companies, as well as drones, to independently measure their emissions. So I believe that this is also being taken to G20 as a potential way of monitoring, third-party monitoring emissions. Demographics. Have any of you heard of Climate Action 100, except maybe Prue? Climate Action 100? It's a global initiative, investor initiative, to a multi-year initiative to engage with companies on how their business strategy how they can cope with climate change and what they're going to do on a few aspects such as better disclosure, better climate-related risk management and opportunities, and also on climate governance. In fact, I just had a meeting yesterday with a Thai company here, just mainly on this issue, and they're progressing very well, which I'm pleased to hear. And this investor initiative has global support, and I would strongly urge that companies' representatives here to look up on the expectations of investors, because more and more questions will be coming your way. And in relation to behavior, I want to share a little story as well. One of our team discussion recently is whether almond milk is a better alternative than cow's milk. And that debate is particularly robust amongst our younger members of the team, because we have more vegans, we have more vegetarians, and some of them have decided not to drink cow's milk at all because of the emissions impact. And then someone actually mentioned that, do you know what, almond milk probably would cause more issues because it takes 4 liters of water to grow 1 almond. Does anyone of you know that? So these discussions are actually taking place somewhere in a young group, maybe in the university, maybe in my son's school, which I think they do talk about these issues. So we see younger and younger generations, they have expectations of their consumer products, what they buy. They want a better understanding of making sure that there's no human rights issues in their supply chain and the products that they buy. They want to have zero impact, which brings us to the zero waste and linear versus circular economy. Has any one of you come across circular economy as a topic? No? It is to go beyond recycling, to look at what are the input of your materials. How can we harness and change the way we process and create products to reduce overall waste in general. So I think in Thailand, 14% of plastics is the main issue in Asia. 14% is recycled, 40% goes to landfill, and then 32% just kind of leak into oceans. You know that contact lenses, if you flush it down the toilet, it goes into water that's consumed by fish. You actually end up eating your own contact lenses. Sorry, I mean, this is not, this is just after lunch, thankfully. So these are the issues that we look at, even within the team, to engage with companies about, are you aware of this? And is there anything that you can do? Which links to the business strategy, the products, how they educate the consumers, etc., etc. But interestingly, plastics in itself, there are more and more ways to be using plastics. In the Netherlands, for example, there is a bicycle track that is made from 70% recycled plastics. There's also a road service in Cumbria in the UK that is resurfaced by recycled plastics. And according to what I know, that the cost of materials is similar, but the robustness of using recycled plastic is 20% stronger, so we can take heavier vehicles. This and in the suburb of Melbourne, they also have they use plastics for covering the resurfacing the roads as well. So there are many new technologies and materials that are coming up, and it is worth companies to look into those opportunities. On human capital, it's another topic that we engage on, and diversity has already been discussed quite widely. But we also engage on the overall talent management activity of a company. We look at how performance is related to sustainability when they are evaluating their performance. So give Hermes as an example. We 50% of our performance is evaluated by whether we're displaying the right kind of behavior. So we do bottom-up evaluation and small team discussion on whether we agree with the company's examples of behavior. So one behavior that we challenge the company on is to work hard and make sure that we don't just stick to 9 to 5 work hours. This was challenged by my younger colleagues especially, is that we should respect that people work in an optimal manner differently. So as a result of that internal discussion, which is a bottom-up approach, we are now changing that to respecting the work patterns and preferences of different colleagues. So in terms of human capital, I think that gives us an example of how this is constantly changing and how a company could embrace feedback from different groups, and expectations keep changing. And finally, on shared economy, whether it is Uber or shared offices or shared housing, so this is becoming a reality. And as a result of that, business models are also changing. For example, car companies no longer talk about selling cars, they talk about mobility solution. And as part of that discussion and process, they also, it also helps them to think about how they can recycle the materials, especially when it comes to electric vehicles, batteries, recycling. And we're talking to auto companies on how they are transitioning to that process. And also workforce protection, because more and more employees are now no longer employees, they might be self-employed. So in the UK earlier this year, there was a Taylor review which talks about the modern working practices. What should be the type of benefits, or should there be benefits provided to what we call dependent workers? So these are the discussions that we're having with companies about what is your talent management process, what is your recruitment process, how can you ensure that you have the right process in place to meet the demands of the new business model that you might be pursuing. So technology is creating new possibilities in ways that we cannot imagine. So can we click on that short video? Does anybody know who she is? Does anyone know? It's okay, it's very short. Can we go back to the slide? Does anyone know who she is? Have you seen her around online? No? Her name is Sophia. Is anyone Sophia? So this video was taken actually before she became famous. She's based in Hong Kong, and a lot of people use her as an example of AGI becoming the reality, well, which is not. If you talk to David Hansen, who created her, and also Ben Gersel, who is the chief technology person, AI person, she's a chatbot. She is a chatbot. She's a very sophisticated chatbot. But it is amazing that when you talk to her about, I'm quite sad today because of this, that, and the other, she would react with a facial expression appropriate to the sentiment that you displayed. So it's not about what she talks about, it's how she reacts to your emotions. And all these things are happening. This is just more visual. The Internet of Things connect different sensors and data to help us manage our daily lives. Do any of you use the Amazon Echo? Intelligent, so you tell them to, computer, turn on the lights, they come on. So I used that, and initially I had a big argument with my husband. I said, we shouldn't have these things at home because they might be listening. And in fact, there were many times when we're watching TV, all of a sudden music comes on, and then it would say something. But then my husband said that do you know that all these smartphones we have here, even if it's not turned on, it is listening, and Apple certainly is. Yeah, at Google you have to say, hello Google, or what do you have to say? Hey Google or something, but Apple you don't, it's always listening. So big data, facial recognition. So one of the countries that are very best at facial recognition is the one that has been gathering data. So China has it is one of the areas that they're especially good at. I remember being at the Alibaba Investor Day last year, and they were launching Smile to Pay. So if they have a facial recognition, when you smile, it helps. That's when you pay for their cup of coffee. So I did question, what if I just want to frown? I mean, can I pay for a cup of coffee if I frown? So that's another area that's getting really interesting, and I'm sure you're used to going to different airports now or in different buildings. They always take a picture of you. Where does all this data go? Where does it go? Where does it store? Do you have access to it? I mean, at the immigration it's different, but at buildings. So this is something that we contemplate, we think about, we talk to companies about. So if it's a property management company, you have this facility, how do you manage that data? Maybe it's not an issue now, maybe it's going to be an issue in the future. Smart cities, managing traffic real time. I mean, this is already happening in some places. And content management and censorship is one of the more difficult areas that we talk to companies about. So we are seeing, especially this year on Facebook, we're seeing that how the content is presented to users have become a bigger controversial issue. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, there was a Congress hearing which they invited Facebook and Twitter and Google to talk about how they manage their content and their algorithms. The Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, she turned up, and Twitter CEO turned up, and unfortunately Google refused to take part. So this is one of the more difficult and evolving issues that we are dealing with. And move on to data ownership. I've already mentioned earlier that it is related to data privacy, and do you want to continue to stay anonymous? What is a company's responsibility? Previously, companies like Facebook would say that I'm just a platform. It's none of my business. I'll just put whatever that's out there. But increasingly, we realize that it is not as simple as that. There is a way companies have a way of skewing one way or another, whether they knew it or not. So, in fact, I have met with Cambridge Analytica. Alexander Nix is a very strange meeting that was before the Facebook issue was become a wider media issue. He was very proud of, and he was actually discussing in a semi-public event that they have been assisting with elections. So it's always been out there influencing people's opinions. So I'm going to speed up a little bit now, and other topics that we engage with companies on includes robot ethics. It is, again, an emerging area when we look at AI ethics. What is the appropriate way to treat the impact of artificial intelligence that might have an impact on jobs? Blockchain. We'll be launching a paper looking at how blockchain can help improve supply chain transparency. This is working with a law firm, and we've seen some concrete examples that are being used. Some of them tend to be more of a hype than actual practice, but it is happening, from shipping to tracking your food source. And I think probably even in Thailand as well, the fish provenance is one area that is worth looking into as well. So let's fast forward, because I think I'm taking quite a bit of time now. This slide is just to share with you that in our stakeholder engagement, we do public policy in all of the areas when we talk about governance, not just governance, but also environment, social, and other issues. And besides the 4 themes that we talked about, we also engage on others: board composition, executive remuneration, and shareholder protection and rights, which is part of governance. And at the same time, more recently, we have been engaging on issues related to sustainable development goals. So this is just a final slide, which I'd like to share with you. Besides what we've talked about, there are different ways and lenses to look at the ESG issues that is relevant to a company. So this is one of the strategy that we have, looking at a thematic approach on impact. If your corporate purpose or part of your sustainability efforts is to create more positive social and environmental impact, these are some of the lenses that you can look through. For example, how are you going to change your energy sources composition? What are the targets that you would like to make to create a positive environmental impact? Circular economy, which I mentioned earlier. Water, in the water stress area, what might be the physical risks of your assets? And how are you going to monitor it? Would it be monitoring supply? Would it be monitoring usage? And what would be your business continuity plan if there is an issue? So I will leave you with that, and thank you very much for your time, and I hope everyone is still partially awake. Thank you.